Ignorance must be replaced by knowledge, competition by cooperation, trust in providence by careful planning, and private capitalism by some form of social economy, and so forth. And then, of course, in 1933, the first Humanist Manifesto was published. Co-author John Dewey. John Dewey's an interesting guy. When David Breese published a book, The 7 Men Who Ruled the World from Their Graves, John Dewey, of course, is listed among them. And much of our predicament today can be laid at his feet, as I think history will show, ultimately. C.F. Foster, one of the co-signers of this manifesto, said in 1930, "Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school a school of humanism. What can theistic Sunday schools, meeting for an hour once a week, teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching?" Interesting insight. 1933, The Shape of Things to Come, H.G. Wells publishes again, predicts a Second World War around 1940 originating from the German-Polish dispute. That's kind of interesting in 1933. After 1945, there would be an increasing lack of public safety in criminally infected areas. The plan for a modern world state would succeed on its third attempt, about 1980, can come out of something that occurred in Basra, Iraq. Kind of interesting perspective for a guy back in the early 30s. Now, the book also says, although the world government has been plainly coming for years, although it has been endlessly feared and murmured against, it found no opposition prepared anywhere. That's his predictive. Now, something else that most people are not aware of is the occultic link to all of this. In 1934, one Alice A. Bailey of the Theosophical Society published The Externalization of the Hierarchy. She's an occultist whose works, she says, are channeled from a spirit guide, the Tibetan master, or demon spirit, Jwal Khul. Bailey used the phrase, points of light, in connection with a new group of world servers, and claims that 1934 marks the beginning of organizing of men and women, a group work of a new order with progress defined by service, the world of the brotherhood, the forces of light, on it goes. Out of the spoliation of all existing culture and civilization, the new world order must be built. This book was published by the Lucifer Trust. That was it changed its name now to the Lucis Trust because it's a little more palatable. The Lucis Trust is the United Nations non-governmental organization, has been a major player at recent UN summits. Later, the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, Robert Mueller, would credit the creation of his World Core educational curriculum to the underlying teachings of Jwal Khul via Alice Bailey's writing on the subject. Did you realize that our educational philosophies, which derive from Robert Mueller's work at the UN, were channeled by a demon spirit? That's kind of interesting. 1932, Plan for Peace by American Birth Control League founder Margaret Sanger was published. She calls for coercive sterilization, mandatory segregation, rehabilitative concentration camps for dysgenic stocks, including blacks, Hispanics, American Indians, and Catholics. We may laugh, I understand, and at the same time realize what's being perpetrated. Interesting. October 28, 1939, in an address by John Foster Dulles, who later became the United States Secretary of State, he proposed that America lead the transition to a new order of less independent, semi-sovereign states bound together by a league or federal union. And of course, in 1939, H.G. Wells is at it again with the New World Order book. He proposes a collectivist one-world state or New World Order comprised of socialist democracies. He advocates universal conscription for service, declares that nationalist individualism is the world's disease. He, quote, the manifest necessity for some collective world control to eliminate warfare and less generally admitted necessity for a collective control of the economic and biological life of mankind are aspects of one and the same process. And he proposed that all this be accomplished through universal law and propaganda or education. In 1940, the New World Order is published by the Carnegie Endowment for the International Peace and contains a selected list of references on regional and world federation and so forth. Now, on December 12th of 1940, in the Congressional Record of the United States, an article entitled The New World Order by John G. Alexander calls for a world federation. In 1942, the Leftist Institute of Pacific Relations published the post-war worlds. It goes on and says, the world government is the ultimate aim. It must be recognized that the law of nations takes precedence over national law. The process will have to be assisted by the deletion of nationalistic material employed in the educational textbooks and its replacement by material explaining the benefits of wiser association. As I read that, I'm reminded a few months ago when my wife and I had an extra day in Washington. We went to the National Museum of American History because we were just in the mood to get all that stuff, and we couldn't find any American history. Lots of exhibits about how we abused the Indians, and there's exhibits of the China of the first ladies through several of the old administrations. No founding fathers, no heritage, no expression of what this country really was founded on. June 28 of 1945, President Truman endorses world government in a speech. He says it will be, quote, it will be just as easy for nations to get along in a republic of the world as it is for us to get along in the Republic of the United States, close quote. And of course, on October 24th of 1945, the United Nations Charter becomes effective. And it was also on October 24th, Senator Glenn Taylor, Democrat from Idaho, introduces Senate Resolution 183 calling upon the United States Senate to go on record as favoring the creation of a world republic, including an international police force. And of course, we have in 1946, Alger Hiss is elected president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He holds this office until 1949 because early in 1950 he is convicted of perjury, sentenced to prison after a sensational trial and a congressional hearing in which Whittaker Chambers, a former senior editor of Time magazine, testifies that Hiss was a member of his Communist Party cell. Interesting. 1946, book by the teacher of the world government by former editor of the NEA Journal, the National Education Association Journal, Joy Elmer Morgan, is published. It says, quote, in the struggle to establish an adequate world government, the teacher can do much to prepare the hearts and minds of children for global understanding and cooperation. At the very heart of all the agencies which will assure the coming of world government must stand the school, the teacher, and the organized profession. 1947, the American Education Fellowship, organized by John Dewey, calls for the establishment of a genuine world order, an order in which national sovereignty is subordinate to world authority. And it goes on like this. I'm not going to get all of these. They'll be in a two-part series in our newsletter, so you can check these out. 1948, Walden 2 is published by behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner, in which he proposes, quote, a perfect society of new and more perfect order in which children are reared by the state rather than by their parents and trained from birth to demonstrate only desirable behavior and characteristics. Skinner's ideas would be widely implemented by educators by the 1960s, 70s, and 80s as values clarification and outcome-based education. And in July of 1948, Britain's Sir Harold Butler, in the CFR's quarterly called Foreign Affairs, sees, quote, a new world order, close quote, taking shape. Quote, how far can the life of nations, which for centuries have thought of themselves as distinct and unique, be merged with the life of other nations? How far are they prepared to sacrifice part of their sovereignty without which there can be no effective economic or political union? Out of the prevailing confusion, a new world is taking shape, which may point the way toward a new order. That will be the beginning of real United Nations, no longer crippled by a split personality, but held together by a common fate. 1948, UNESCO President and Fabian socialist Sir Julian Huxley calls for a radical eugenic policy in UNESCO, its purpose and philosophy. He states, quote, thus, even though it is quite true that any radical eugenic policy of controlled human breeding will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable. You see, they chip away inch by inch. They're patient. Also in 1948, the preliminary draft of a world constitution is published by the United States educators advocating a regional federation on the way toward world federation or government, with England incorporated into a European federation. The Constitution provides for a world council with a chamber of guardians to enforce the world law. Also includes a preamble calling for the nations to surrender their arms to the world government, and includes the right of this, quote, Federal Republic of the World, close quote, to seize private property for federal use. On February 9th, 1950, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee introduces the Senate Concurrent Resolution 66, interesting number, which begins, whereas in order to achieve universal peace and justice, the present Charter of the United Nations should be changed to provide a true world government constitution. This resolution was first introduced in the Senate on September 13th, 49, by Senator Glenn Taylor, and Democrat in Idaho. Senator Alexander Wiley, Republican in Wisconsin, said that it's a consummation devoutly to be wished. For he said, I understand that your proposition would either change the United Nations or change or create by a separate convention a world order. Senator Taylor later stated, quote, "We would have to sacrifice considerable sovereignty to the World Organization to enable them to levy taxes in their own right to support themselves." On April 12th of 1952, John Foster Dulles, again, he said in a speech to the American Bar Association in Louisville, Kentucky, quote, "Treaty laws can override the Constitution." He pointed that out. He says treaties can take power away from Congress, give them to the President. They can take powers away from the states, give them to the federal government or to some international body. They can cut across the rights given to the people by their constitutional Bill of Rights. A Senate amendment proposed by Republican Senator John Bricker would have provided that no treaty